Rancher buys the wild girl no man could tame, but she rode straight into his heart. The town had only one main road, and dust always floated above it like a thin cloud. People there believed they understood everything that happened within their fences. So when the young woman arrived, quiet and guarded, it did not take long for whispers to follow her steps. She came on the back of an old supply truck that stopped near the feed store. She carried only one small suitcase and wore boots that had clearly walked through hard places. Her eyes did not wander with curiosity like a visitor's would. They scanned the town as if measuring it, as if asking a silent question: is this place any different? No one greeted her with warmth. They simply stared. Some men leaned against wooden posts and shook their heads. A few women standing near the grocery shop lowered their voices but did not lower their curiosity. "That's her," someone whispered. "The wild girl." They had never spoken to her, but they had already given her a name. She had been staying at a small farm just outside town for a few months before trouble started. The farm owner, an older man struggling with debt, had taken her in when she needed work. She had agreed to help in exchange for a roof and meals. But when the crops failed and bills piled up, he made a hard choice. He arranged for her to transfer her work agreement to a larger ranch nearby. Some people described it like a transaction. That word traveled fast. The ranch belonged to a widowed man named Daniel Carter. He was known for running one of the most successful cattle operations in the county. He spoke little, worked hard, and rarely attended town gatherings unless business required it. Since his wife passed away 3 years earlier, he had kept mostly to himself. When Daniel heard about the arrangement, he did not respond with excitement or concern. He simply asked one question: "Can she work?" The farm owner nodded. "Harder than most." That was enough for him. The first time Daniel saw her was late afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the open fields. She stood near the barn, arms crossed, chin slightly raised. She did not look frightened. She looked prepared. Daniel walked toward her with steady steps. He removed his hat in simple greeting. "You must be Lee," he said calmly. She did not smile. "That's what they call me." He noticed the way she answered, not rude, just guarded. "You'll have a room in the west wing of the house," he continued. "Work starts at sunrise. We don't waste daylight here." She nodded once. "I don't waste time." That was their first exchange. Short, careful testing. From the porch of a nearby property, two neighbors watched closely. They expected raised voices by nightfall. They expected her to argue or refuse orders. They expected Daniel to regret the decision within days. Lee followed him into the barn without waiting for instruction. She examined the equipment with sharp attention. Her hands ran across the wooden handles of tools, checking their condition. She looked at the horses with quiet understanding. Daniel noticed she did not step back nervously. Instead, she stepped forward slowly, allowing one horse to smell her palm before she touched its neck. "You've worked around animals before," he observed. "I've worked around worse," she replied, then quickly turned away as if she had said too much. Daniel did not ask questions about her past, not that day. Inside the ranch house, the air felt still. It was clean but carried a silence that had lasted too long. Lee placed her small suitcase on the narrow bed in her assigned room. She did not unpack fully. Only a few clothes went into the wooden drawer. The rest remained folded in the case, ready if she needed to leave quickly. That habit had followed her for years. The next morning, she rose before sunrise. She did not wait for a knock on the door. By the time Daniel stepped outside, she was already near the fence line, examining a loose board. "You plan to fix that?" he asked. "Yes." "You know how?" She gave him a steady look. "I wouldn't have said yes if I didn't." There was no challenge in her tone, only certainty. The work was heavy and constant. Feeding cattle, repairing fencing, cleaning stalls, hauling supplies. Most newcomers would slow by midday. Lee did not. Sweat covered her brow and dirt streaked her sleeves, but she never complained. By afternoon, Daniel noticed something else. She worked alone whenever possible. If another ranch hand approached, she would finish the task quickly and move to another area. It was not dislike. It was distance. During lunch break, she sat under a tree instead of joining the others near the barn. She ate quietly and kept her gaze on the horizon. The open land stretched endlessly, fields rolling into pale hills. For a brief moment, her shoulders lowered. The tension she carried seemed to loosen just slightly. Daniel observed from afar. He had managed people long enough to recognize fear when he saw it, but Lee's behavior was different. She was not afraid of work. She was not afraid of animals. She was afraid of being cornered. In town, the stories grew larger each day. Some claimed she had a temper that drove people away. Others said she could not follow rules. A few insisted she would leave before the first month ended. "She won't last," one shopkeeper declared confidently, but Lee did last. On the fourth evening, a small incident tested everything. A young ranch hand made a careless remark, joking that Daniel must be brave to take on trouble. Lee heard it clearly. She set down the water bucket and faced him directly. "If you have something to say it to me." The yard fell silent. The young man shifted awkwardly and muttered that he meant no harm. Lee held his gaze a moment longer before turning back to her work. Daniel approached later, not with anger, but with calm authority. "On this ranch," he said firmly to everyone present, "we speak with respect or we don't speak at all." Lee heard him. She did not look at him, but something in her expression softened. That night, as the sky darkened and stars appeared, she stood alone in the pasture. The wind moved gently across the grass. The land felt wide and open, not like the crowded places she had known before. Daniel stepped outside and saw her silhouette against the fading light. "First week isn't easy," he said quietly. "I've known harder," she replied. He nodded. "You're not owned here." She looked at him sharply, as if testing whether the words were real. "You work," he continued. "You earn, that's all." For a long moment she did not answer. Then she said something unexpected. "Most people don't say that." Daniel adjusted his hat. "Most people talk too much." A small breath escaped her lips, not quite a laugh but close. Days turned into a steady rhythm. Sunrise work, midday heat, evening repairs. Lee's movements became more confident across the property. She memorized the layout of fences, learned the behavior of specific cattle, and even began assisting with training a young horse that had been difficult for months. She did not try to dominate the animal. She approached with patience. When the horse resisted, she waited instead of forcing it. Daniel watched carefully. He saw a reflection of something in her, strength without cruelty, firmness without harm. One evening, heavy clouds gathered suddenly. Wind picked up and distant thunder rolled across the hills. A section of fence near the northern pasture had been weakened earlier in the week. If it broke, several cattle could wander off. Before Daniel could give instructions, Lee was already moving toward the barn to saddle a horse. "Storm's coming," he warned. "I know," she answered. They rode out together as the first drops of rain began to fall. The wind pushed against them, but neither slowed. When they reached the damaged fence, the wood had already begun to split. Without speaking, they worked side by side. She held boards steady while he secured them. Mud soaked their boots. Rain plastered her hair against her face, but she did not step back. At one point, lightning flashed in the distance. For a second, fear flickered in her eyes. Daniel noticed, but he did not comment. He simply handed her another tool. When the fence finally stood firm again, both were breathing hard. The storm began to pass as quickly as it had arrived. They sat on their horses for a moment, looking at the repaired line. "You didn't have to ride out alone," Daniel said quietly. "I wasn't alone," she replied. It was the first time her words carried trust instead of defense. As they rode back toward the ranch house, the sky cleared slowly. The sunset broke through fading clouds, casting gold across the fields. From the porch, one of the ranch hands watched them return. He expected shouting or blame after the storm. Instead, he saw something else. They dismounted in silence, tired but steady. No arguments, no regret. Later that evening, Lee stood again in the open field, the air fresh after rain. She breathed deeply, feeling the space around her. For the first time in years, she did not feel like she was waiting to run. Life on the ranch settled into a steady rhythm, but that did not mean it became easy. Each morning began before the sky turned fully blue. The air felt cold at dawn, and the ground held the quiet promise of another long day. Lee woke without needing a call. She dressed quickly, tied her hair back, and stepped outside before anyone else finished their coffee. The ranch was alive even before sunrise. Horses shifted in their stalls. Cattle moved slowly in the distance. Birds cut through the sky in dark shapes against pale light. Lee paused for a moment near the fence, taking in the wide land stretching beyond the hills. She still carried her guarded nature, but the open space felt less threatening now. Daniel noticed her consistency. She never asked for easier tasks. She never tried to avoid responsibility. If anything, she took on more than expected. At first, the other ranch hands kept their distance. They were unsure how to approach her. Rumors from town had painted her as unpredictable. Some watched her closely, waiting for a mistake. Others simply avoided conversation. Lee did not seem bothered. She focused on her work and let actions speak instead of words. One morning, Daniel assigned her to help repair an old gate near the southern pasture. The wooden structure had aged, and parts of it had begun to weaken. It required patience and careful handling. "You'll need support beams here," he explained, pointing to a section where cracks had formed. She examined it carefully, running her hand along the wood. "It'll hold if we reinforce the base first." He raised an eyebrow slightly, surprised she had noticed immediately. "You're right." They worked together quietly. The sound of tools hitting wood echoed softly through the open air. There was no rush, only steady effort. As the sun climbed higher, Lee wiped sweat from her forehead and stepped back to examine their progress. Daniel watched her carefully, measuring the alignment before tightening the final bolt. "You don't like shortcuts," he said. "They break later," she replied simply. It was one of the longest conversations they had shared so far. Later that week, a new challenge tested the fragile balance between them. Daniel instructed her to help organize supplies in the storage barn. The task required teamwork with another ranch hand named Ethan, who was known for being talkative. Ethan tried to make casual conversation while stacking feed bags. "So, you planning to stay long?" he asked. Lee hesitated before answering. "I don't plan too far." "That sounds tiring," he said lightly. She gave a small shrug. "It keeps things simple." Ethan nodded, sensing the boundary she had drawn. Still, his friendly tone slowly eased the tension. By midday, they worked more smoothly together. Daniel watched from a distance, noticing something important. Lee did not reject kindness when it came without pressure. She simply needed time. Despite progress, disagreements between Lee and Daniel still happened. She had strong opinions and did not hesitate to question decisions she did not understand. One afternoon, he asked her to move a group of cattle toward a new grazing area. She studied the land carefully before speaking. "They'll push toward the water if we drive them from that side," she said. "That's the plan," he replied. "They might scatter." He paused, considering her point. "We'll adjust if they do." Lee frowned slightly but followed the instruction. As they worked, the cattle did begin moving unevenly, and a few broke away toward a shallow slope. Instead of frustration, Daniel signaled for her to redirect them using her earlier suggestion. Afterward, he approached her quietly. "You saw something I didn't." She looked uncertain, waiting for criticism. "Next time," he continued calmly, "explain your reasoning sooner." Her expression softened. "I will." It was a small moment, but it built mutual respect. Days passed, and the ranch began to feel less like a temporary stop for Lee. She learned the names of horses. She remembered which gates needed extra force to close. She even started leaving her suitcase slightly open instead of packed tightly. The town, however, continued watching closely. Whenever Lee accompanied Daniel into town for supplies, people stared openly. Some nodded politely. Others whispered behind their hands. At the general store, a woman approached Daniel quietly. "You sure about keeping her around?" she asked. Daniel's voice stayed calm. "She works hard." "That's not what I meant," the woman replied. He did not argue. He simply paid for the supplies and left. Lee noticed the exchange but did not ask about it. She was used to being judged before being known. One evening, a sudden windstorm rolled across the land, stronger than expected. Dark clouds gathered quickly and dust swept through the ranch yard. A group of younger horses became restless, pulling against their leads. Without waiting for instruction, Lee moved toward them, speaking softly to calm their movements. Daniel joined her, and together they guided the animals into a more secure enclosure. As the wind howled, one horse broke free and ran toward an open section of fence. Lee reacted instantly, grabbing a rope and moving after it. Daniel followed, concerned but trusting her instincts. The chase was intense but controlled. She guided the horse gently instead of forcing it, gradually turning it back toward safety. When they finally secured the animal, both were breathing heavily. "You handled that well," Daniel said. She gave a small nod. "It wasn't angry, just scared." He studied her carefully. "You understand fear." Her eyes flickered with something deeper before she looked away. "Everyone does." After the storm passed, they sat in the barn with steaming cups of coffee. Rain tapped softly on the roof. The quiet between them felt different now, not heavy but comfortable. Daniel spoke slowly. "People in town talk too much." "I noticed," she replied. "You don't have to prove anything to them." She stared at the floor for a moment. I'm not trying to. Good, he said. Just keep doing what you're doing. That simple statement stayed with her. As weeks turned into another month, the ranch began to change in small ways. Lee started laughing occasionally at small mistakes. She joined meals with the other ranch hands instead of eating alone. She even suggested improvements to daily routines that saved time and effort. One evening, while fixing a saddle, she asked Daniel a question for the first time that was not related to work. "Why do you stay out here?" she asked. He thought for a moment. "Because the land doesn't lie," she considered his answer quietly. "I like that." He looked at her, noticing the way she seemed more relaxed now, less tense. "You're different than when you arrived," he said. "So are you," she replied before realizing what she had said. A small smile appeared between them, brief but genuine. The change between them was not loud or dramatic. It grew slowly, like grass after rain. Trust built through shared work, long days, and silent understanding. But just as things began to feel steady, a new shadow approached from beyond the ranch boundaries. Neither of them knew yet that someone connected to Lee's past had arrived in town, asking questions. For now, the ranch felt peaceful. The sky stretched wide above them, and the evening sun painted the fields with warm light. Lee stood beside Daniel near the fence, watching cattle move calmly across the land. She felt something unfamiliar growing inside her. Not fear, not urgency, but the beginning of belonging. The ranch had finally started to feel steady. The days moved in a simple rhythm, and Lee no longer felt like a visitor passing through. She walked the land with confidence now. She knew which horses preferred gentle handling and which ones tested patience. She understood the timing of feeding and the pattern of the wind before sunset. Daniel noticed these changes quietly. He noticed how she no longer scanned the horizon as if expecting trouble. He noticed how her voice had softened when speaking to the animals. He even noticed that she had unpacked the rest of her suitcase. But peace rarely stays untested. One afternoon, while Daniel and Lee were loading feed into the truck near town, a stranger stood across the street watching them. He leaned against a post outside the general store, his hat low over his eyes. Lee froze for half a second when she saw him. Daniel noticed immediately. "You know him?" he asked calmly. Lee's jaw tightened. "I used to." The man did not approach them that day. He only watched. But the look on his face carried old memories Lee had tried to leave behind. On the ride back to the ranch, she remained silent. The open road that once felt freeing now felt heavy with something unspoken. "You don't have to explain," Daniel said after a while. "I know," she replied quietly, but the silence between them that evening was different. It was not comfortable like before. It carried tension. The next morning, rumors spread through town faster than wind through dry grass. The stranger had been asking questions. He claimed Lee still owed money from years ago. He told people she had left without settling her responsibilities. By midday, two ranch hands approached Daniel carefully. "There's talk in town," one of them said. "That man says she's running from something." Daniel's expression did not change. "Is she doing her work here?" "Yes." "Then that's what matters." But whispers have power. By the end of the week, the story had grown larger than truth. Some claimed she had stolen. Others said she had broken agreements. Each version became more dramatic than the last. Lee heard enough to understand what was happening. She felt the old weight pressing on her chest again, the same feeling that had followed her from place to place. That evening, she stayed late in the barn, pretending to check equipment. Daniel found her there, sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at the ground. "He's telling stories," she said without looking up. "I've heard," Daniel replied calmly. "They'll believe him." "Some might." She finally lifted her eyes. "You will too." Daniel studied her face. He saw fear there, but also something deeper, expectation of disappointment. "If I believed every story I heard," he said slowly, "I wouldn't trust anyone." She swallowed hard. "He says I owe him money." "Do you?" Her silence stretched for a long moment. "I owed once," she admitted, "but I paid in work. He changed the numbers, said it wasn't enough, said I'd never finish." Daniel leaned against the stall door, arms crossed loosely. "And you left?" "Yes." "Did you sign anything?" "No," he nodded slightly, thinking. "Then it's his word against yours." "That's enough to ruin things," she whispered. Daniel shook his head gently. "Not here." The following day, the stranger finally came to the ranch. He rode up slowly, confident and smiling in a way that did not feel friendly. Daniel met him near the gate. "I'm looking for Lee," the man said. "She's working," Daniel replied evenly. You can speak here. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. This is between me and her. She works here, that makes it my business. Lee stepped forward before Daniel could say more. She stood tall, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. What do you want? She asked clearly. The man spoke loudly enough for nearby workers to hear. You owe money. You left before settling it. I worked it off, she replied. You worked some, not all. Lee's breathing grew shallow, but she did not step back. Daniel stepped forward slightly, but did not interrupt. Show proof, Daniel said calmly. The man hesitated. It wasn't written. Then it's just talk, Daniel answered. The stranger tried another approach. She runs when things get hard, ask around. Daniel's voice remained steady. She's been here months, she hasn't run once. The man's smile faded. He realized he was not gaining ground. Lee spoke again, louder this time. I don't owe you anything. Her voice carried across the yard. Ranch hands paused their work, listening. You can't just decide that, the man replied sharply. I can, she said, because I know what I gave. There was strength in her tone now, not fear. Daniel turned to the man. If you have legal claim, bring it properly, otherwise don't come back. The words were simple but firm. The stranger looked around, realizing he had no support. The ranch workers stood quietly behind Lee and Daniel. No one moved toward him. No one agreed with him. Finally, he turned his horse and rode away, though not without one last glare. Silence lingered in the yard after he left. Lee's shoulders sagged slightly as the tension drained from her. She had expected to stand alone. She had prepared herself to pack her suitcase again. Instead, she found Daniel still beside her. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. I didn't do anything, he replied. You spoke for yourself. She looked at him carefully. You believed me. I watched you, he answered. That's enough. That evening, the sky burned orange as the sun lowered. Lee walked toward the pasture alone, needing space to think. Daniel followed at a distance but did not interrupt her silence. For years, she had lived ready to leave. Every place had been temporary, every connection fragile. The moment trouble appeared, she moved on, but this time was different. This time, someone had stood beside her without trying to control the outcome. Someone had given her the choice to fight her own battle. Daniel approached slowly. You planning to go? He asked gently. She looked out over the wide land. The fences stood strong. The cattle grazed calmly. The house lights glowed softly in the distance. I thought about it, she admitted, and, she shook her head slightly, I'm tired of running. The wind moved through the grass around them. You don't have to prove yourself here, Daniel said quietly. I know, she replied. For the first time, the fear in her eyes was replaced with something steadier, determination. The next few days were not easy. Town gossip continued, but it slowly lost power. Without proof or support, the stranger's claims faded. He stopped appearing near the ranch. Lee continued working, but something inside her had changed. She walked straighter. She spoke more openly during ranch discussions. She even offered ideas during planning meetings without hesitation. One afternoon, while reviewing supply lists, she looked at Daniel and said, I want to stay, not because I have nowhere else to go, because I choose to. He met her gaze calmly. Then stay. No grand promises, no dramatic speeches, just choice. As the sun set that evening, Lee stood near the same fence where she once felt like an outsider. Now the land felt different beneath her boots. She was not the wild girl running from shadows anymore. She had faced her past and remained standing. The days following the confrontation felt calmer, but the calm was different from before. It was no longer fragile or uncertain. Instead, it carried a quiet strength. Lee moved through her work with a sense of ownership she had never allowed herself to feel before. She was no longer just someone passing through. She was part of the ranch's rhythm. Morning light stretched across the land as she walked toward the stables. The horses greeted her with familiar movements, some lifting their heads when they heard her steps. She spoke softly to them, her voice steady and warm. The ranch hands noticed how naturally she handled the animals now. Even the younger workers began asking her for advice. Daniel watched these changes quietly. He did not interfere or praise loudly. He simply observed, recognizing that confidence had replaced much of the guarded tension she once carried. One afternoon, he called her over while reviewing the seasonal plans for grazing rotation. I want your opinion, he said, pointing at a map spread across a wooden table. Lee hesitated for a moment. Mine? Yes. She studied the map carefully, tracing the fields with her finger. The north pasture recovered faster than expected, she said slowly. But if we move too many cattle there, it won't last. Maybe split the herd and rotate earlier. Daniel listened closely. He nodded. That's a good plan. It was a simple exchange, but it meant more than either of them admitted aloud. He trusted her judgment. She trusted herself enough to give it. The ranch hands noticed too. Their attitude toward Lee had shifted completely. Where once there had been distance, now there was respect. They joked with her during lunch breaks. They shared stories about old ranch mishaps, and she even laughed openly at times. One evening, the town held a small gathering near the community hall. Daniel rarely attended such events, but this time he agreed to go because the ranch needed supplies that would be distributed there. Lee hesitated before deciding to accompany him. As they entered town, people turned to look, but the stares felt different. Less judgment, more curiosity. A few greeted her politely. One older woman even thanked her for helping repair a fence near her property during a recent storm. Lee felt unsure how to respond to kindness. She simply nodded and smiled faintly. Inside the hall, music played softly. Conversations filled the air. Daniel stood near the supply table while Lee walked slowly through the crowd, observing quietly. A man approached her and said, "You're the one working at Carter Ranch, right? Heard you handled that runaway horse last week." She blinked in surprise. "Yes, good work," he said simply before moving on. The moment stayed with her. People were starting to see her for what she did, not what they had heard before. Later that evening, she and Daniel stepped outside to escape the noise. The sky above the town glowed with stars. "You don't like crowds," he said gently. "I'm learning," she replied. He smiled slightly. "That's progress." They stood in comfortable silence. It felt natural now, without tension or awkwardness. On the ride back to the ranch, Lee spoke unexpectedly. "Why did you trust me so quickly?" Daniel thought for a moment before answering. "I didn't trust quickly, I watched. You showed who you were." She absorbed his words quietly. No one had ever described her that way before. The next few weeks brought new challenges. The ranch prepared for a busy season, and long days returned. Lee took on more responsibility, often leading small tasks without being asked. Daniel began delegating decisions to her, trusting her instincts. One afternoon, while training a young horse known for being difficult, Lee pushed herself too hard. The horse suddenly shifted direction, and she lost her balance, falling to the ground. Pain shot through her shoulder. She tried to stand quickly, but Daniel was already there, kneeling beside her. "Stay still," he said calmly. "I'm fine," she insisted, though her voice betrayed discomfort. "Let me see," he replied. Reluctantly, she allowed him to help her sit up. His movements were careful, steady. There was no urgency in his tone, only quiet concern. "You need to rest," he said. "I can keep working." "You will rest," he answered firmly but gently. She wanted to argue, but something about his calm certainty made her pause. For the first time, she allowed herself to lean on someone else without feeling weak. The injury was minor, but it forced her to slow down for a few days. During that time, Daniel handled most of the physical work while she focused on planning and organizing tasks. They spent more time talking than they ever had before. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Daniel spoke about his past. "I used to think silence was easier," he said. "After my wife passed, I stopped letting people get close." Lee listened quietly. "The ranch became my way of avoiding everything else," he continued. She nodded slowly. "I understand that. What about you?" he asked gently. She stared at the horizon before answering. "I learned not to stay anywhere long. If you don't stay, you don't lose." Daniel considered her words. "But you stayed here." "Yes," she said softly, "because it feels different." The air between them felt warm and honest. There was no pressure, only shared understanding. As her shoulder healed, Lee returned to full work, but their relationship had shifted again. There was an ease between them now. Small gestures spoke louder than words, sharing coffee before sunrise, working side by side without needing instructions, exchanging quiet smiles after long days. The town continued to change its opinion of her. During a local market day, she helped organize supplies for families affected by recent storms. People thanked her openly. The nickname Wild Girl faded, replaced by something kinder. One afternoon, a group of children visited the ranch on a school outing. Lee showed them how to approach horses calmly, teaching them patience and respect. Daniel watched from a distance, surprised by how naturally she guided them. Later, he said, "You're good with people." She laughed softly. "That's new." "Maybe it was always there," he replied. As the season moved forward, their emotional connection deepened quietly. Neither rushed to define it. Neither felt the need to speak grand words. Instead, it grew through shared trust. One evening, after finishing repairs near the far pasture, they rode back slowly as the sky turned golden. The land stretched endlessly before them, peaceful and open. Lee broke the silence. "I don't feel like running anymore." Daniel glanced at her. "That's a good feeling." "Yes," she said, smiling slightly. They reached a hill overlooking the ranch. Below them, the house lights glowed warmly and cattle moved slowly through the fields. They stopped there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around them. Lee realized something important in that moment. The ranch was no longer just a place she worked. It was a place she belonged. The ranch moved into a new season, and with it came a quiet sense of completion. The fields stretched wide and green under the open sky, and the steady rhythm of work continued as always. But something had changed deeply inside both Lee and Daniel. What had once been simple cooperation had grown into trust, and what began as trust had slowly become something warmer, something that neither of them rushed to name. Lee woke before sunrise as she always did, but now she paused longer on the porch, watching the horizon turn from dark blue to soft gold. The air felt fresh and full of possibility. She no longer carried the weight of needing to leave. Instead, she felt rooted, steady, and calm. Inside the ranch house, small signs of change appeared everywhere. A few potted plants rested near the windows, something Lee had added without thinking too much about it. A blanket she liked was folded neatly over a chair. The house no longer felt empty. It felt lived in. Daniel noticed these things quietly. He never made a big comment about them, but he appreciated how the house felt warmer now. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. Work on the ranch grew busier as the season changed. New calves required attention, fences needed reinforcing, and supply runs became more frequent. Lee took on responsibilities naturally. She organized schedules, helped train younger ranch hands, and suggested improvements that made daily work smoother. One afternoon, while reviewing feed supplies, Daniel watched her carefully explaining a plan to one of the newer workers. Her voice carried calm confidence. She listened when others spoke, adjusted her approach when needed, and never tried to control through force. He realized then how much she had changed since arriving. The guarded distance had faded. In its place stood someone strong but open, steady but warm. Later that day, they rode together across the northern pasture to inspect grazing areas. The sky stretched endlessly above them, and the land felt quiet except for the sound of hooves against the ground. "You've changed this place," Daniel said suddenly. She looked at him, surprised. "How? You made it feel less empty." She smiled faintly but said nothing. Compliments still felt unfamiliar, but she no longer tried to deflect them completely. As they reached a hill overlooking the ranch, they stopped to rest the horses. The wind moved gently through the grass. "I used to think I'd stay alone forever," Daniel admitted quietly. "It felt easier," Lee nodded slowly. "I used to think I'd never stay anywhere long." They shared a quiet laugh at the similarity. The connection between them had grown slowly, built from shared work and honest moments. Neither had rushed forward, neither had forced anything. But now, standing side by side under the open sky, the feeling between them felt undeniable. In town, people noticed the change too. Lee walked through the streets with confidence, greeting familiar faces. The whispers that once followed her had disappeared. Instead, she heard simple greetings and friendly conversations. During a local gathering, someone jokingly referred to her as the wild girl. The words were spoken lightly, without harm, but Daniel responded calmly. "She was never wild," he said. "She just needed space." The statement spread through the crowd quietly. Lee felt warmth rise in her chest. It was not just the words themselves, but the way he spoke them, with respect and certainty. That evening, they returned to the ranch as the sun set behind the hills. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, reflecting off the fields. They worked together to finish the last tasks of the day. As darkness settled, they sat on the porch, sharing a simple meal. Lee looked out at the land, thinking about how far she had come. She remembered the first night she arrived, ready to leave at any moment. Now she could not imagine walking away. "You never tried to change me," she said softly. Daniel considered her words. "I didn't think you needed changing," she smiled gently. "Most people did." "Most people don't listen enough," he replied. The quiet between them felt full, not empty. Over the following weeks, their bond deepened naturally. They worked side by side, laughed more often, and shared stories from their pasts without fear. Lee told him about the many places she had traveled, the lessons she learned through hardship, and the reasons she once avoided staying anywhere too long. Daniel listened without judgment, offering understanding instead of solutions. One evening, after finishing repairs near the barn, he asked her to walk with him across the fields. The sky above them glittered with stars, and the night felt peaceful. "I've been thinking," he began slowly. She looked at him, sensing the importance of the moment. "I don't have perfect words," he continued, "but I know I don't want to go back to the way things were before you came here." Her heart beat faster, but she stayed calm, waiting. "I don't want to offer promises that sound too big," he said. "I just want to build something real together." Lee took a deep breath. For years, she had avoided moments like this, afraid of losing herself. But standing there now, she felt different. She felt strong enough to choose connection without fear. "I don't need saving," she said softly. "I know," he replied immediately. "That's not what this is." She smiled, relief and warmth mixing in her expression. "Then yes," she said quietly, "I want that too." The moment was simple, honest, and real, no grand gestures. No dramatic declarations, just two people choosing each other freely. Life on the ranch continued, but everything felt brighter. They made decisions together, shared responsibilities, and built routines that reflected partnership rather than loneliness. Lee planted a small garden near the porch, something she had never done before because she never stayed long enough to watch things grow. Now she looked forward to seeing it change with each season. Daniel found himself laughing more often, something the ranch hands noticed immediately. The house felt full of life again. One morning, as they rode out to check the far pasture, Lee realized she no longer felt like someone running from the past. She felt like someone building a future. The land stretched endlessly before them, open and calm. The wind carried the scent of grass and sunlight. She turned to Daniel and smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "This feels like home," she said. He nodded quietly. "It is." The girl no one thought could be understood had found a place where she did not need to be tamed or changed. She had simply been given space to grow.